I've been thinking lately about the strange temporality of deadlines. Is there more than a superficial family resemblance between the emergencies we suffer on a daily, yearly, and epochal basis? Due dates, expiration dates, foreclosure dates, biological clocks, execution dates, revolutionary crisis points, environmental tipping points, messianic end times. I find as soon as I've said that sentence that there's something awkward and offensive about the bland capaciousness of this list, and I'm still finding it a little bit hard to find a way to address this. This talk was really triggered by a pair of counterintuitive observations and a puzzlement. First observation, the deadline seems to speak of the implacable indifference of measured time, but it imposes itself in anything but a homogeneous manner. The deadline demonstrates precisely why Marx was right to emphasize that political economy is always a political economy of time. Time flows at differential rates. Like all emergency measures, deadlines are coercive institutions that distribute privilege unevenly. Time limits are imposed, extensions are granted, penalties are imposed, time runs out faster and hangs more heavily for the disenfranchised. In other words, the deadline, like death itself, is what Marx would call a real abstraction. It universalizes itself in a palpably discrepant and exclusionary fashion. The deadline marks the place where the homogeneous continuum of time erupts into a minefield of exceptions. But the reverse is equally true, and this brings me to my second counterintuitive observation. Kierkegaard dwells on the paradox of Christianity. Eternity enters time. In the leap of faith, in the act of grace, in the incarnation, the continuum of time is interrupted. Psychoanalysis alerts us to the opposite paradox. Time enters eternity. This is what happens when the timelessness of the unconscious is invaded by the exigencies of schedule. As Freud will never stop reminding us, there is no time, he says, in the unconscious. Impervious to chronology, indifferent to causal or temporal sequence, oblivious of developmental milestones, that's why everybody's, such a baby, disrespectful of generational differences, think of Oedipus, intransigent, inefficient, rudely sabotaging the schedule of family, school, and workplace. The unconscious can be nonetheless preternaturally sensitive to the ticking and rustling of clock and calendar. This is demonstrated at the end of every analysis, at the end of every session, and even at the end of every sentence. We can discern here a simultaneous resistance to modern administrative rationality and a mobilization of its core devices. And my puzzlement, finally, my third and final point, concerns the peculiar rhetoric of hyperbole and how the literal has a way of flipping into the most portentously symbolic. Nowhere more so than we think and speak about deadlines. So I've been writing a number of short pieces, and I'm going to present to you a few of these tonight. 4. Real writers, says the writer Karl Kraus, and he means by this not hacks or journalists, are the ones who need no deadlines, a chastening thought. Anyway, I was startled to discover that this terrible word was coined in the prisoner of war camps of the American Civil War. The deadline was the distillation of architectural terror in its starkest form. Sometimes the deadline was a flimsy railing. You can see one there. Sometimes a ditch, a rope, a row of stakes, sometimes even an invisible or imaginary line of demarcation, a fragile, inconspicuous marker placed some 20 feet within the prison wall, as menacing as it was intangible. The deadline served to double physical confinement with symbolic terror. Ineffective and unnecessary as a material barrier. You all see it, right? Yes. On the outside, the blurry in the foreground is the huge, impenetrable stockade walls, and inside is this flimsy little piece of railing called a deadline. Ineffective and unnecessary as a material barrier, the deadline was all the more overwhelming in its performative impact. It transformed a space of physical confinement into a scene of negative interpolation. It marked the fragile zone where the impossible became the prohibited and where space and time converged. If you crossed the deadline, if you put your toe beyond it, if you brushed against the railing, your fate was sealed. The guards, perched in high watchtowers all around the camp's perimeter, were rewarded with extra furlough leave for every prisoner shot. The prisoner of war camps, like all camps, were unwieldy spaces of exception, temporary places that had suddenly become permanent, overflowing their capacity almost as soon as they were constructed. The most notorious of these camps was called Andersonville, a Confederate camp in southern Georgia, far from the front lines, from the border states, and from state borders. Andersonville was architecture at its most elementary, nothing more than an open field cordoned off by a double row of high and impenetrable wooden stockade walls, without time or materials to build barracks, or even enough time to protect the prisoners from the blazing summer sun or the freezing winter rain. The camp had been set up almost overnight, about a year before the war's end, to contain the swelling number of captives after the collapse of the Dix Hill prisoner exchange cartel in 1863. That exchange whereby each party would give up a captive prisoner of war in exchange for getting one of their own back. That exchange had come to an abrupt halt after Lincoln started conscripting African-American soldiers into the Union Army. The Confederacy had refused to recognize captured Black soldiers as prisoners of war, or even to confirm their status as captives. Even to acknowledge them as enemies would be already to concede far too much. Denied both military and civilian status, unqualified to be quantified, to be assigned a numerical value. And so according to the calculus of the original exchange, a corporal was worth 2 privates, a captain was worth 6, a colonel worth 15, and so on and so forth. Everybody had their value or portion of a value. Black soldiers had no numerical value attached to them, so they couldn't be traded. So unqualified to be quantified, these soldiers would be classified as fugitive slaves and summarily shot on capture, returned to their putative owners, or drafted into forced labor for the Confederate Army. Some of these newly minted slaves were immediately put to work constructing the prison camps from which they would be forcibly excluded, clearing the forest, hewing the timber, and building the stockade walls that would confine the expanding population of their former fellow soldiers. From the outset then, and we can return to this, the deadline would prove to be a kind of white man's privilege. We can come back to this historical irony and to some of its ongoing aftermath. The collapse of the prisoner exchange had produced a sudden surge in the camp population. By the war's end, the population of Andersonville had swollen to 3 times its capacity, making the camp equivalent to the 5th largest city in the Confederacy and by far the densest. At its peak period, the average living space was 20 square feet per person. During the last year of the war, almost a third of the camp's population died of disease or starvation. Andersonville became the very emblem for the North of Confederate atrocity, the subject of innumerable eyewitness accounts, photojournalist reportage, propaganda, reports from the U.S. Sanitation Department, and official investigations. The infamous commander of the camp, whose name was Henry Wirtz, would be convicted of war crimes and executed with great fanfare in Washington immediately after the war's end. In 1909, a large monument in his honor was erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in downtown Andersonville, not far from the prison site, in an attempt, and I quote from the monument, to rescue his name from the stigma attached to it by embittered prejudice. That memorial is still standing, apparently unperturbed by the Bildersturm that has recently been sweeping through American campuses and cities. It continues to attract pilgrims. Andersonville would remain an essential reference point in the memory politics of Reconstruction and beyond. After the war, the diaries and memoirs proliferated. Everybody kept talking about the deadline. Survivors drew maps and diagrams. They drew pictures of the deadline. They recounted the daily dramas that kept erupting in its vicinity. So you have to imagine in this place, the deadline really demarcated a kind of stage space, a kind of proscenium stage, by means of which life could become a kind of drama, could become a kind of performance. And the deadline actually became the space which, for the prisoners, at least in memory, according to their own memories, sort of acted out some kind of drama. There was the story of the starving prisoner who was shot when he leaned over the deadline to grab a moldy scrap of bread. The prisoner who reached over the line to scoop a cup of water from the stream just on the other side. The prisoner who put his hand under the line to pick up a little piece of kindling. The prisoner who slipped on the mud not far from the deadline and lost his balance. The prisoner who lay down too close to the deadline, and the camp was so overcrowded, this was almost unavoidable, and while sleeping, managed to stretch his fingers a few inches too far in the wrong direction. There was the disabled man who stumbled into the railing. There was the story of the madman who kept lunging at the deadline, determined to get to the other side, screaming that death would be an improvement. There were tales of brinksmanship and bravado. There was a group of prisoners who kept up the morale by organizing nightly dances at the deadline. The dead bodies heaped up on the other side of the deadline. Since there was usually no way for the prisoners to retrieve the corpses for burial, they would lie rotting in the blazing sun. Overwrought tales of heroic escape only underscored the fact that the choice between staying and leaving was a forced one. It ultimately made no difference which side of the line you ended up on. Even if you were to tunnel your way out from under the stockade walls without being detected, an almost unimaginable feat for starving prisoners trapped in an open field, the army dogs would track you down. You'd get lost and starve to death in the thick surrounding forest. And even if you managed to find your way out, the nearest city was so far away that the chance of blending into the local population was almost zero. Death had, in any case, already pervaded the compound. Even when invisible, the deadline was just about the only discernible line of demarcation in this zone of exception where almost every distinguishing mark had been effaced. Both time and space had become disoriented and stagnant, without any clear expectation of a date of release, without the regimen of work or the routine of regular mealtimes. The prisoners endured the amorphous, directionless time of slow starvation. Even the river flowed backwards. The camp was so overcrowded that the prisoners kept forgetting which end of the stream was to be used for drinking water and which end for the latrine. The boundary between life and death had been eroded, as had the boundary between the human and the inhuman. Reports compared the huddles of half-alive bodies to swarms of insects or to maggots. Photographers came to take pictures of what they called the living skeletons that crowded the camps, while the actual corpses heaped up and festered on the other side of the line. Some of these horrifying photographs, and atrocity photography was one of the several technical or technological innovations that was bequeathed by the American Civil War, along with long-distance railroad, telegraph, and so on. Some of these horrifying photographs would be circulated as collectible kind of carte de visite, published in popular magazines, used as evidence in congressional investigations, and disseminated as propaganda during the last years of the war and Reconstruction. The deadline itself, a little piece of wood, would eventually become a relic, remembered only by Civil War buffs and etymologists. But the drama of the deadline would continue to unfurl. Okay, so here's my second section. Here's my second piece. Although we often speak of deadlines as looming unpleasantly somewhere out there in the future, it strikes me that the real deadlines are usually in the past. We dread them, we ignore them, we anxiously leap up to meet them. Whatever happens, the encounter is usually a violent one, and the enemy is usually personified. Where once Father Time haunted our imagination, now it's the deadline we've come to hate and fear. A deadline is something you wrangle or wrestle with, something you beat or hit or run smack up against like a brick wall. But for the most part, by the time we confront a deadline, it's either useless or impossible to meet it. Like every ultimatum delivered by a desperate lover, the very compulsion to set a deadline usually involves a tacit confession that it's probably too late to make a difference. Think of global warming. Think of the so-called two-state solution. Think of every "I'm going to give you one last chance" blurted out by an exasperated parent. And that foolish phrase is, of course, the telltale formula of ineffective parenting, as all parents know. This is why the proclamation of a deadline can pivot so easily between rallying call and resignation. The pressure of the deadline is not diminished by the fact that the window of opportunity has already closed. This is the sense in which Benjamin will recycle Schlegel's description of the historian as a prophet facing backwards. The urgency of the messenger is only heightened by the fact that the storm's damage, and I just want to pause here to underline Benjamin's uncannily prescient image of global warming, has already been irreversibly inflicted. This shows not only that prophecy has nothing to do with prediction, but also that there's a Cassandra in every prophet. Prophecy is a failed speech act, not because its forecasts are hyperbolic or unfounded, but because its performative effect is hindered. It's too late to make a difference. The impending catastrophe has already happened, and prophecy itself turns into an opportunity for further prevarication. Like every emergency measure, the deadline is a temporal Trojan horse, a line scratched in the quicksand of time. The deadline is a Medusa. It paralyzes you with the certainty of failure, and it pacifies you with the promise of yet another reprieve. In the deadline, time both contracts and stretches. It simultaneously quickens and thickens. It's too late, it's too early, there's not enough time, there's too much time. Why start now? It's impossible. Why start now? It's unnecessary. There's no point trying. There's no reason to start, not just yet. The deadline is a futile, retroactive performative. It's the deadline itself that prevents you from meeting it. This is formalized in the many, many languages, English not being one of them, that testify to the inseparability of deadline and deferral, which is perhaps why so many languages have ended up defaulting to the English loanword deadline when it's a question of actually getting things done, like in business or law, something like that. Le délai, in French, is the ultimate stretching or dilation, the last possible moment beyond which no further delay will be tolerated. Die Frist in German, which is etymologically akin to first, English first, is the outer limit of a time span, the last extension beyond which time will extend no further. There's a hard-to-translate verb in German, Fristen, which captures this paradoxical state of suspension at the order, to live on the edge, to eke out a bare existence. Fristen, and Dasein, Fristen, is to inhabit the desperate zone where the distinction between life and death itself hangs in the balance. Galgenfrist, which has to do with the gallows, is the last minute just before the criminal is hanged. This can coincide with the Gnadefrist, the narrow window within which the penitent can still appeal to God for grace. So grace has there's a time limit for getting grace, getting forgiveness. And this, by the way, is the original meaning of the word short shrift. The term originally referred to the abbreviated penitential sacrament offered to the prisoner just before his execution. I mean, if you're about to be executed and you haven't had time to do all the proper rites, there's a mechanism whereby the priest can come and do it in a rushed way, and that will count. Shriving, as the name suggests, shriving, which is deathbed repentance. Shriving, as the name suggests, is already a schrift, a script, an inscription or incision, a cut in time. The shortened schrift, a nick in time, pronounced at the nick of time, is a nick in the nick. So it's a speech act, a bridge to its absolute minimum duration. This is about as compact as speech can get. Far from indicating indifference or disregard, as we tend to use the term short shrift today, the short shrift brings language to a pitch of intensity and efficacy. The sacramental shortcut contracts speech to an extreme of formulaic concision. To speak of deadlines and their extension is not simply to make a formal dialectical point about limits and their overstepping, as in Hegel's infamous refutation of the Kantian beyond, or Jenseits, namely, and this is Hegel's whole point, and his whole, what he considers to be his absolute rebuttal of Kant, namely, that to draw a boundary, a limit to knowledge, a limit to experience, to draw a boundary is already to have extended your reach beyond it. Why? Because if you can draw a boundary, you've already, implicitly crossed to the other side because you didn't know where it ends up. What appears to be an impermeable boundary or Schranke turns out to be a mobile and porous border, Grenze. The limit generates its own surpassing. The law is constituted by its own transgression. This kind of argument, and I've really just given you Hegel's signature move in a nutshell, has often been mobilized to advance a view of the Hegelian dialectic as a mechanism of compulsive overreaching, limits that are drawn only to be swept aside, climaxes that turn out to be anticlimaxes, goalposts that are repeatedly moved mid-game. Sometimes these descriptions are made admiringly, sometimes reproachfully, sometimes in an effort to convict Hegel of some kind of logical malfeasance. These descriptions are apt as far as they go, but they are one-sided, to use Hegel's language, in that they collapse the limit into a perpetual antinomy between obstacle and transgression, turn the dialectic into a bad infinite of deferral or endless kind of overreaching, and turn time into a unidirectional linear advance. But the deadline shows precisely how the compulsive pressure, the drive or pulsion of the dialectic works in both directions at once. Every limit repulses you backward with the same pressure as it propels you forward. Every progression is for this reason also a relapse or regression. And one reason why, as anyone who's worked with Hegel will find out the bitter hard way, it's so difficult to get anything done in anything like an efficient manner, because every time you're pushing forward, like surpassing a given limit, you're by that same token being thrust backward. Crossing the deadline is not enough to free you from the deadline's coercive pressure. Even missing the deadline, having the term expire, still brings no relief from its looming pressure. The missed deadline charges all time with its retroactive power. This is not simply because the experience of the expiration of the deadline inevitably generates a new one. The so-called hard deadline turns out to have been a soft one after all. You must once more go through the humiliating ritual of apologies, excuses, negotiations for yet another extension. Or they give you an extension, even though you never asked for one, and it's the last thing you actually want or need. You want to be allowed your delinquency. You want to declare bankruptcy. You want to default, to be done with contrition and further punishment. But the debt accumulates and the carrying costs mount. This is what happens, as some of you must surely know, when defaulting on loans is not an option, for example, with student loans in the US or for poor countries the world over. In such cases, the penalty for missing the deadline exacts an ever more brutal one. Deadlines breed and proliferate and exert a radioactive charge on everything and everyone in the vicinity. But this also happens even when you meet a deadline. You can only meet the deadline by passing on the costs to others who are forced to confront far more punishing deadlines of their own. Every drama of brinksmanship, and you know when you're up against your own deadline, there's nothing more solitary and heroic than being up against a deadline where you feel it's all up to you. Every drama of brinksmanship enlists a large supporting cast, usually invisible and underpaid, and requires a supply chain of just-in-time delivery services on a global scale. Or there's so many competing deadlines that they all short-circuit. The short-term deadlines take precedence over the long-term ones. You're obliged to make priorities, which invariably prove to be the wrong ones, and to take shortcuts, which inevitably make you waste even more time. You put out the fire while the planet burns. Although his normative language can be off-putting, this is what Heidegger is talking about, I believe, when he describes the temporality of everyday, inauthentic Dasein. That would be us. We are so distracted by the ping of deadlines that we end up like Kafka's Hunter Gracchus, missing the hour of our own death. That this lapse is structural, that the lapsus is primal or constitutive, and I am circling around here the logic of trauma, ultimately, does not mean it is natural, that it is suffered equally, or that its consequences are evenly distributed. This is another way of saying that the deadline has the character of a real abstraction. Evocative as it sounds, then, this terrifying word turns out to be a complete misnomer. The deadline is not really a line at all. Far from being an inert marker, it's a spreading capillary tangle, and it is anything but dead. The deadline grows. It swells, it breeds, it forks and fissures. It lives on long beyond its own expiration date. The deadline is the figure of the undead. Okay, moving to my third, completely different section here. 3 out of 4. The fourth is very short. Here's my third section. Only the devil can fix a deadline, but he's the exception that proves the rule. This is the Faustian bargain. The scholar, as it happens, finally gets time for himself. He gets to enjoy infinite control over his time. He gets to own his own time on condition that its endpoint is contractually fixed. Also, he goes straight to hell when the time is up. So I'm talking about every version of Faustus here, with the exception of Goethe's Faust, which is does very odd, different things with temporality. And you know the basic deal. Dr. Faustus, who's kind of sick of study. He's kind of learned everything. There's nowhere to go. He wants more, and the devil comes along and basically gives him anything he wants as long as it's term limited, and he gets to choose the date. It will expire in 24 years, but in the meantime, he's omnipotent. Paradoxically, it's the inexorable fixity of death that gives Dr. Faustus a kind of immortality within his own lifetime. Within the measured span of time allotted to him, the doctor will be immune from time's depredations. He gets to enjoy an eternity of quality time, of perfect time, uninterrupted by the randomness of death or any other annoying intrusions, injuries, or inhibitions. As long as he lives, and this only sounds oxymoronic, so I'm going to say it, as long as he lives, Faustus is immortal. No accident will befall him. Nobody can get to him. Nothing can impinge on him. No one can intrude on him. His time is his own. Lawrence Rickles has argued, and this sounds dead right to me, this sounds right to me, that this is the basic difference between the devil and the vampire. Unlike the vampire, who indefinitely pushes back the deadline by imposing an endless extension of life, but thereby effaces the boundary between the living and the dead, the devil inscribes an indelible boundary between life and death, but thereby bestows on death its own deadly eternity. For Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, this immortality is demonstrated in the fact that Faust himself gets to set his own deadline. 24 years is a term of his own choosing. This creates the illusion that there is an end to time, that time itself is something that can be surveyed, captured, controlled, and ultimately eluded. By assigning his own expiration date, Faustus not only claims divine ownership over his allotted lifespan, but he gets to see this end. In signing his own death warrant, he literally signs it in blood. In signing his own death warrant, Faust at once stages a demonic, suicidal parody of Christ's sacrifice and establishes his own credentials as a man of modern science and commerce. Faust's entirely secular experiment, this is worth noting given that he's completely engaged with the devil, his completely secular experiment is to create the illusion of simultaneity, to capture time's ephemerality by segmenting time into a sequence of frozen moments. Hence the insistent visuality of the Faustian quest, the protagonist's unbounded desire to see and to show everything, to have everything flash before his eyes in a moment of instantaneous total vision. Hence, too, the incessant production of pageantry to the point of buffoonery. Theater simultaneously affirms and struggles against its own temporal dilation by splintering into an accelerating series of discontinuous abbreviated tableaus. Above all, the play stages a confrontation with the ineluctable curvature of theatrical time, whereby every character is doomed to fall into extinction when the curtain drops. And by that same token, doomed to come back into life the very next evening. Marlowe turns a theatrical contract between player and spectator into a Faustian contract. More precisely, he demonstrates that all theater is a kind of Faustian contract. For the price of a ticket and for the absolutely fixed duration of the performance, ordinary time is suspended. Theater and psychoanalysis have this much in common. Maybe more things too, but definitely this much. That the contractual term is exactly 24 years neatly seals off the dramatic action within the unified circle of a single day. In allotting himself this particular lifespan, Faustus pays superficial homage to the unity of time mandated by tragic convention. The other so-called Aristotelian unities, unity of space, unity of action, and so on, the other so-called Aristotelian unities are flagrantly disregarded in this imperial cartographic drama that will span the globe, explore heaven and hell, and stretch out in all directions, from the underworld to interstellar space. But the idea of a 24-year day, essentially a day, already defines time as a continuum of uniform duration. It suggests that there is such a thing as a quantity of time, that time is something that can be mechanically measured, divided, and distributed. Dr. Faustus thus puts on stage the installation of the homogeneous empty time, the modern clock time, what Jacques Le Goff calls the merchant's time, that was in the course just then of smoothing over the lumpiness of medieval time with its own uneven distribution of prayer times, saint days, holidays, anniversary days, the so-called dismal days, the dies mali, literally the evil days, the awkward, untimely, sometimes called Egyptian days, the still cluttered, the Elizabethan calendar. All that unevenness, which characterizes medieval time, is done away with the installation of the modern temporality that's measured by a mechanical clock. For Dr. Faustus, time appears as an abstract commodity that can be bought and sold, just like the soul that stands as legal tender. The Faustian Contract is a secular commercial transaction, signed in sacramental blood, but drafted in modern bureaucratic legalese and accompanied by a 5-part scroll written in fine print. When Lucifer's henchman comes at the end of the play to collect Faustus and bring him down to hell, he appears not only as a medieval grotesquerie, but as a functionary of the nascent capitalist state. So there's a kind of short-circuiting of time and history here, which is of a piece with the temporal contraction that Faust is trying to perform by opting for a 24-year interval, which is basically his version of the dramatic, the Renaissance interpretation of the Aristotelian unity of time, where everything had to happen within a single day. So Faust's whole life becomes a single day, a 24-year day, which manages to condense all of history in a sense, in that you have the kind of the medieval and the capitalist and capitalist modernity just actually fusing. They lock horns, they link. Faustus wants to have control over temporality itself. The issue is not what he can buy or do with time, or even what he can enjoy or experience in his allotted lifespan. This is perhaps why he wastes so much of the play asking Mephistopheles foolish questions, planning extravagant sightseeing trips, and performing ridiculous parlor tricks for anyone who will watch. Even as Faustus keeps insisting on the intensity of his gluttonous appetite, his longing, as he keeps describing his longing to be ravished, his insatiable thirst for profit and delight, his craving for, in his words, power, honor, or omnipotence, all these objects prove to be vanishing approximations of something impossible and undefinable. The impossibility is not because the object of desire is an unattainable or otherworldly blue flower, but rather because there is ultimately no object of desire. Faust's ultimate desire is just to desire, which is to say, all he wants is time. Achievement, knowledge, enjoyment, recognition, even experience prove to be overrated commodities when time itself is on the market. This is a subtle but crucial difference between Faust's deadline and Achilles's. When Achilles, as you might remember from Homer, when Achilles opts for what he calls a short, glorious life, to die when he chooses to die young in battle rather than to survive, which would be to potter around, as he sees it, to potter around, getting fat and boring. He is trading in the limited longevity of a still mortal lifespan for the more durable gratifications of unending heroic glory. There is thus for Achilles a non-temporal payoff. Such a reward is unavailable, but also irrelevant to Faustus. Faustus does not stake his immortality on the permanency of tangible achievements, fame, or reputation. He does need an audience for his magic tricks, it is true, and he seems to need or want other men to share his lust for Helen. He wants his desire to be desired, but this penumbra of recognition, this sharing of his own personal drama is ultimately more as a stage prop than for the purposes of real legitimation. He wants an audience because it's part of the show rather than because he actually needs an audience. It's not even the saturated intensity of the lived moment that Faustus is after. What is at stake for Dr. Faustus is time as such, and not what he makes of it. And here's the paradox. To experience the passage of pure time, time in its unsaturated emptiness, is to register time's fracture into a spray of vanishing instants. But to witness this passage, you need something to happen, or at the very least, you need to find a way to witness its non-happening. You need to convert a non-happening into an active unhappening, a determinate negation of happening, to turn the absence of event into a negative event. You need to see something, even a negative or scotomized, blanked out something, to see the nothing that makes it visible, that is, time. This is Faustian theater. It's literally all about making by marking time. We often speak of the need to make time to do things. I've got to make some time here. Make time to do things. We save the date, we set aside the time, we make time to see a show. For Dr. Faustus, it's the other way around. He puts on a show to make time appear. This is also the difference between the Faustus story and all the superficially similar myths and fairy tales that seem likewise to revolve around deadlines. The miller's daughter must spin all that straw into gold by morning or else. The lazy princess must spin all that thread within 3 days or else. Hercules must finish all those chores on time. He must clean up the Augean stables before sunset. He must kill the Nemean lion before the month's end, or else. These deadlines are all conditional. There are consequences for failing to meet them. In Kantian terms, such deadlines present a hypothetical rather than a categorical imperative. They are actually a threat masquerading as an injunction. All these down-to-the-wire races against time are premised on the likelihood of Hercules losing the race, which is also why there's a fundamental lack of clarity about the terms of winning and why the rules prove to be slippery and full of loopholes. Hercules' tormentor will feel no compunction about adding 2 supplementary labors as soon as the hero has, against all odds, completed his original roster of assignments on time. Maybe he cheated. He got help, didn't he, cutting off the Hydra's heads. Maybe this or that task shouldn't really count. He got paid, after all, for cleaning out the stables. The Faustian deadline is categorical. Okay, I'm basically done. I just have one tiny little epilogue-like section to read, and then I will be done. So, 4th small section. For Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, the immortality granted by a deadline springs from a deadly diagnosis. By deliberately contracting a terminal disease, the composer, Adrian Leverkühn, finally manages to get his work done. So here's this composer who's kind of been wallowing in this sort of creative rut for forever. Can't really compose, he can't really work. So his particular version of the Devil's Pact is to go and get sick. As his syphilis gestates, his genius incubates. He breaks through his artistic paralysis. He clears away the Western musical tradition. He undoes Beethoven. He invents 12-tone music. He essentially becomes Arnold Schoenberg. All this with a little help from Adorno, who acted as privy counselor to Mann, supplying the novelist with the theory, the descriptions, and even snide philosophical commentary on Leverkühn's compositions. This was to the real Schoenberg's consternation, who was appalled to find his innovations not only baldly, and as far as he was concerned, badly plagiarized by a fictional persona, but travestied as an unsubtle allegory of totalitarian ideology. As his contractual term expires, again in 24 years, Leverkühn finally completes the symphonic cantata that will revoke the triumph of Beethoven's Ninth, stripping art of its last shred of consolatory heroism. Dr. Faustus rewrites the Ode to Joy as an endless lamentation. The twist, and here I'm stopping, the twist is not that Leverkühn fails to meet the deadline, that he doesn't finish his composition, or that the result is botched. It's rather that even though he succeeds, he fails. He's robbed of the opportunity to consummate his life's work at 0 hour, or for that matter, even to have a 0 hour. The tragedy is that the hero cannot enjoy the privilege of tragic closure. Although he meets the deadline, the composer is unable to perform his own swan song, or even to die. Upon attacking the first piano chord at the public premiere of his cantata, Adrian Leverkühn collapses of a paralytic stroke and is condemned to while away the remaining decade of his life, Nietzsche style, a burnt-out husk consigned to the care of his mother. The work thus remains irredeemably unfinished, even though it is finished. Unperformed and unplayable, both within and beyond the composer's lifetime, the cantata lingers on as a spectral remainder, as does its author. Forced to outlive his own deadline, Dr. Faustus is refused even the determinate torment of eternal damnation. Like the bombed-out cities and concentration camps of post-war Germany, this is Thomas Mann's somewhat heavy-handed analogy here. Dr. Faustus is delivered to the living hell of a posthumous existence.